Hi everyone. In today's video, I'm going to be talking about my first 20 cold approaches and what I learned from them. So, for those of you who don't know, cold approach is essentially when you go up to a woman you see in public and you start a conversation to get her number and eventually go on a date. And cold approach is a pretty common strategy and practice in some online communities, including, the pickup artist community, the red pill community, sort of. And cold approach is a good way to build your skill set and learn more about how to interact with women. And the amount I've done, 20, is not a lot. It's not a lot of approaches, but it's enough to where I could give some advice and some tips to guys who have never approached before, which is the vast majority of guys, especially young guys today. So, to start out, here's some data to give some, context about my approaching. So the time frame in which I did these approaches was August 2025 to August 2026, which is roughly 1 year. So I turned 18 in June 2025, and then 2 months later, I decided to start approaching. I did it in two separate chunks throughout the year. I was the two times of the year I did approaching was August 2025 and September 2025, and then June 2026 to now. In August and September, I did 5 approaches. And these approaches, I would say they were mixed, but probably leaning towards not going very well. I mean, I didn't get any numbers, but I think I really did learn some things from doing them. But I only started actually getting results from approaching within the past 2 months. It took me a while to do 20 approaches. And that's because I don't have a coach or anything like that who's helping me along with this. I had to do this on my own. And it was a pretty difficult and arduous task. But eventually I desensitized myself enough to where I could get up to 20 approaches. Actually, I did the bulk of these approaches within the last couple of weeks. Since like the start of July, I've been doing approaches consistently. And before then, I had only done like a 5 or 6. Like I did one in very early June, but I've only been consistently approaching within the past couple of weeks. So it's very new for me. But I did have a little bit of experience to draw on. So yeah, I've done 20 approaches and I got 4 numbers. So the conversion rate is 4 out of 20, which comes out to 20% or 1/5. And I got 0 dates from this. So could you say that I got success from approaching yet? I mean, it depends on if you consider a number a success. So it's pretty up in the air if approaching has been successful for me so far, but I have benefited in many ways that I'm going to be going over in this video. And the style I've been using is day game. And day game is when you approach women during the day in a public area. So this could be on the street. That's probably the most common. In a public park, at a mall. The opposite of that is night game. So night game is going to be usually when you're approaching a woman at a bar or a club where alcohol is involved. And this is actually more men are willing to approach in these environments because they're specifically designed for approaching. But I'm under 21. I'm not sure if there are any clubs that allow people that are under 21. But, as a 19-year-old, I can still do day game. So here's the first lesson I learned from cold approach. It takes longer than you think. So this comes from my personal experience, especially because I haven't had a coach, and that has probably exacerbated it. But even if you do have a coach, it's going to take longer than you think. You know, you're going to have to stay consistent for a long period of time. And that's mainly because when you start out, your anxiety level is going to be very, very high. Very high. And it's going to take a long time for you to get desensitized to this. Maybe on the lower end it'll take you weeks, but on the higher end it'll take you months or even years to desensitize yourself enough to where approaching can become a habit, which was definitely the case for me. It took me a year of exposure to finally get up the nerve to start approaching consistently. And the success rate is lower than you'd expect. Starting out, a lot of guys think that they're just gonna, go out and approach, and that they're gonna get numbers on the first day that are gonna lead to dates and eventually lead to women having sex with them. The success rate is pretty low. So the success rate of cold approach varies depending on what you consider a success. But for example, let's take the percentage of time, but the percentage of the time you get a number. How about that? So the percentage of the time you get a number is going to be probably to the tune of like anywhere from like 10 to 30%, which is not very high. So going into an approach, you should probably expect to get rejected, especially early on, you know? And not in a negative way, like, oh, she's going to reject me. You can say, you know what, I'm probably going to get rejected, but who cares? You know? It's just the price I have to pay. And here's lesson number 3: you have to walk around. So this is the number one way I got myself to approach, especially early on, is I would walk around for long periods of time. I would walk around for hours during a week. And eventually, walking around will get so annoying that you're just going to approach. You know? So, as many of you have probably heard, humans tend to follow the path of least resistance, which means that we avoid suffering and we do the thing that's easiest and is going to give us the most pleasure and least amount of suffering. If you're walking around for hours and not approaching, that's probably going to hurt. That's probably going to affect your psyche a little bit because you're going to start thinking, well, why can't I do this? Why am I so scared? I feel paralyzed. I just want this to end. I want to start dating. I want to start talking to women, but I just can't do it. And eventually, you're just going to say, screw this, and start approaching, which is what happened to me. Eventually, you're going to say, you know what? I'm tired of this. I'm just going to rip the Band-Aid off, and I'm just going to do it. So lesson number 4. Beginners need to be direct. So the way I learned this is that in the spring, I started, starting conversations with women. I wasn't approaching women, but I decided that I needed to desensitize myself. I did a challenge where every single day for a month, I was going to start a conversation with a new woman. I was going to have a short interaction with a woman on my college campus every single day. And going in, I expected that maybe I would get like 1 or 2 numbers from doing this. And I would be able to see that, some of the women would be receptive and I would be able to go for them without having to show intent, which is the scariest part. Being direct with my intentions and giving a girl a compliment. I thought that maybe if I just exposed myself enough times that one of these interactions would turn into a romantic or sexual frame. But that never happened. What instead happened is that I had a bunch of short interactions that went nowhere. I just had some short platonic interactions that maybe desensitized myself to starting conversations, which is good, but it didn't get me to do any actual approaches or get any results from approaching because they weren't approaches. They were just starting conversations. And this is why beginners need to be direct. Because if you're not direct, you're probably just going to be too scared to transition the conversation into something romantic. You're just going to have a platonic interaction and it's going to fizzle out and you're going to walk away. Beginners need to be direct off the opener. They need to give a girl a compliment and ask for her number. Those are two crucial. If you don't ask for the number, then you automatically lose. Because the point of approaching, is to desensitize yourself, is to gain a skill set, but the primary purpose of it, if you're trying to date, is to get a number. If you don't even give yourself a chance to win, then you have a 0% chance of succeeding at getting a girl's number. Because the girl isn't going to offer up her number. Exposure therapy. Exposure therapy is essentially when you become progressively desensitized to something through being exposed to it. And progressive desensitization is a specific kind of exposure therapy, actually. It's when you progressively do harder and harder things, things that scare you more and more, until eventually you work up the courage to do the thing. Me starting out, just starting conversations, is an example of progressive desensitization because I went from doing that to starting to actually do direct approaches regularly. So the way this works is that you can start out by maybe going for easier targets, which is something that I've done. Don't do the scariest approach the hottest possible girl who's with all her friends at first, because you're probably just gonna, get rejected and it's gonna burn you out if you keep doing these hard approaches. Do the approaches that are a bit easier. Don't approach women that are just not attractive to you at all. Approach women who are kind of mid, average looking, or maybe even slightly below average looking to desensitize yourself. That's a great idea. You know, if a woman is attractive enough to where you could see yourself sleeping with her, then why not approach her? And it's going to progressively desensitize yourself to um, approaching. So if you approach, a 5 out of 10, then it's going to be much easier to approach a 7 out of 10 if you haven't approached any women at all. Most of the skills are going to be the same. It's just going to be slightly more difficult. Here's lesson number 6. You typically never regret doing an approach. This is from my own personal experience. Going into an approach, it's very scary. You feel like something bad is going to happen. You get into your body has that fight or flight response. But once you actually start doing it, your anxiety level is going to go down. And after you do it, you're going to feel a sense of accomplishment because you're going to realize lesson number 7 is don't draw conclusions too quickly. So, this is some advice I heard, in the process of doing approaches. And I honestly didn't even listen to it very much. I drew conclusions at times from the approaches I did. So I was thinking to myself, maybe I'm just not good at this cold approach thing. Maybe there's just something fundamentally wrong about my vibe, whatever that is, that I just makes women not attracted to me, that repels women. But 5 approaches is nowhere near enough to draw conclusions. Even 20 approaches is not enough because this isn't a large enough sample size. And especially early on, you're not going to be used to it. So maybe you're just going to be so nervous that you're messing up the approaches. So I wouldn't draw conclusions from your earliest approaches. So here's lesson number 8. Bad rejections aren't rare, but you must persist. So women are increasingly suspicious about cold approach. I'm just going to be honest. A lot of women will say that they want to be approached, but they want it in a very specific context and a pretty specific guy most of the time. So a lot of women are actually going to be uncomfortable if you approach them, but some of them won't be. You just have to find the ones that aren't going to be uncomfortable. But if you have a standoffish, bad interaction where the woman kind of looks at you like you're doing something wrong or gets uncomfortable, that's not the end of the world, but it's also not going to be rare. I've definitely had, at least one really bad rejection, and then maybe I had like, I don't know, a few other rejections that were a little bit awkward, made me feel a little bit, uncomfortable, a little bit, down on myself in the moment, but I just kind of recovered from them because I realized that approaching is necessarily going to get some bad reactions because women vary in how they react to approaching. They're not going to be universally receptive to you, but they're also not going to be universally not receptive to you. It's going to be very mixed just in its nature. And bad rejections are just a necessary thing that needs to happen for you to improve, you know? And at the end of the day, it's going to be worth it because would you rather, get some bad rejections, some bad reactions, and then eventually find success or just never try in the first place and never get rejected, but you just stay at home and you just never improve and you never find a girlfriend, you never, lose your virginity, you never ascend. Here's lesson number 9. Momentum is real. So this is something that, people that approach will talk about a lot, is that you will get momentum from approaching, which is something that I didn't experience until the last couple of weeks. So momentum in approaching is basically building up the rate at which you approach. From approaching, you're going to start approaching more and more because you're going to get more used to it, and you're going to get positive reinforcement from the amount of wins you have, most likely, if you're not, very bad looking. I always say if you're at least a 4, you're going to get at least some positive results from approaching. If you're at least a 4, you're probably going to get at least one number from approaching 20 women, and that should be enough to keep you going. But when you're starting out, every single approach feels like you have to try very hard to do it. You have to basically force yourself to do it. Especially I haven't gotten to the point where I can do like 4 or 5 approaches when going out for an hour. It'll usually take me like 2 hours of going out to do like 2 or 3 approaches at the most. And here's lesson number 10: action matters more than having game. So before I started approaching, I thought that game was more important than it actually is when starting out. I thought that if I just started reading all this game stuff, that when I approached, I would be prepared and I would be able to, strategize and say the right thing to get the results I wanted. But in the moment, you're not going to be able to apply all the stuff that you know. You're not going to be able to apply, you shouldn't say this. You should, open this way. You should close this way. You should, talk about this. You should avoid this topic. You're not going to be able to apply that when you're responding to a woman in real time. When you first start out, you're just going to take action and it's going to be imperfect. But taking action is actually going to teach you more or just as much as having game knowledge, having the knowledge of what is technically good game. If you just learn through experience what works for you from trial and error, that's going to be very valuable and you're going to be more calibrated when you approach. It's going to be unconscious, a lot of it. A lot of it is stuff that you're just automatically going to avoid and know not to do from bad responses in the past. And a lot of it's going to be stuff that you know to do because it has worked in the past. And this is already starting to happen to me from my relatively small sample size of 20 approaches. That's enough to where I can learn some things and find what works for me. But later on, you are going to want to learn a game because, your approach definitely does matter. The way you approach, what you say, and your body language and all that absolutely does matter. But it's not something that you can really work on when you're not approaching consistently. If you don't try at all, then you have no chance of winning. So, this is probably the most important lesson. And maybe. Thanks for watching, everyone. And if you have any experiences of your own from approaching that you want to share, or any questions for me, please leave them in the comments below.